"We're not going to make it to your graduation, sweetie," my mother said, her voice carrying that particular tone of cheerful dismissiveness I'd learned to recognize over 22 years. I stood in my dorm room at MIT, phone pressed to my ear, looking at the graduation announcements I'd just finished addressing, my parents' names written carefully at the top of the list. Sienna's yoga instructor certification celebration is that same weekend in Sedona, and you know how important this is for her journey. My father's voice joined in on speakerphone, tag teaming as they always did when they knew I might object. "You understand, right, Maya? You've always been so independent, so capable. Sienna really needs us there for support. This certification is everything to her right now. Plus, you'll be so busy with all your friends and the ceremony is so long, you probably won't even notice we're not there." I sat down on my bed, the announcement slipping from my hands and scattering across the floor. 4 years at one of the most demanding schools in the world. Summa cum laude. A job offer from a top tech company in San Francisco starting at $140K. None of it mattered as much in that moment as the casual way they'd just told me they'd be celebrating my sister's weekend workshop instead of my college graduation. "It's fine," I heard myself say, my voice steady despite the tightness in my chest. "I understand." And I did understand. I understood perfectly, because this was the pattern we'd established long ago. Probably around the time I was 12 and won the regional spelling bee on the same day Sienna had an art show at her high school. My parents had come to the last 15 minutes of my competition, watched me win, took a quick photo, then rushed across town to spend 2 hours at Sienna's exhibit, where her mixed media piece about teenage angst had earned an honorable mention. I remembered standing on that stage with my trophy, looking out at the mostly empty auditorium, watching other kids run to their parents' arms while I held my medal and wondered what I'd done wrong. "We'll send a gift," my mother was saying now. "Something special, and we'll video call right after. We promise. Sienna's thing ends at 3, so we'll have time before the group dinner she planned. You know how much thought she puts into these gatherings." I looked at my computer screen, at the thesis I'd spent 18 months developing, at the emails from professors calling it groundbreaking work. I thought about the nights I'd survived on coffee and determination, the internships I'd worked to pay for my living expenses, even with a full scholarship, the way I'd learned to celebrate my own achievements alone because there was never quite enough room in my family for both Sienna's dreams and my accomplishments. "Sure, Mom," I said. "That sounds great. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click. But for me, it means a lot." After I hung up the phone that day, I sat surrounded by those scattered graduation announcements and let myself remember all the other times my achievements had been footnoted in the story of Sienna's journey. When I was named valedictorian of my high school class a month before graduation, my parents had taken me to dinner at our local Italian restaurant, the one with the red vinyl booths and breadsticks in plastic baskets, and my father had raised his glass of house wine and said he was proud, that he'd always known I'd do well, that I made everything look so easy. We'd been home by 8 because Sienna had called crying about her boyfriend threatening to break up with her before prom, and the rest of that evening had been spent with my mother on the couch, holding Sienna while she sobbed, my father making tea and speaking in soothing tones about how that boy didn't deserve her anyway. My valedictorian speech, which I'd spent weeks writing, had been printed out on the kitchen table, and I'd found it the next morning with a coffee ring staining the second page. When my MIT acceptance letter arrived with the full scholarship notification, the first full ride they'd offered in 3 years, I'd run downstairs waving the letter, 17 years old and bursting with the kind of joy that felt too big for my body. My mother had hugged me, genuinely pleased, and called my father at work, and for maybe an hour I'd felt like the sun in our family's solar system. Then, Sienna had come home with her bags, 21 years old, and moving back into her childhood bedroom after dropping out of art school in Portland. And the rest of that week had been about helping her unpack, about assuring her that she was brave for knowing when something wasn't right, about my parents explaining to concerned relatives that Sienna was taking time to find herself, and that was just as valuable as any degree. My scholarship letter had ended up on the refrigerator, buried under grocery lists and Sienna's schedule for her shifts at the yoga studio where she'd started taking classes. Over the next 4 years at MIT, I'd watched my parents pay Sienna's rent for 3 different apartments, each one a fresh start that didn't quite work out. I'd added up the numbers during a particularly lonely night my sophomore year when the family group chat was full of pictures from Sienna's birthday dinner at an expensive restaurant downtown, while I'd eaten ramen in my dorm room because I was between paychecks from my campus job. Conservative estimate, they'd given her $3,200 a month for rent and utilities, bought her a used Honda Civic for $15,000, funded 2 failed business ventures including a jewelry line and a lifestyle blog that had cost them at least $8,000 combined, covered her health insurance, her phone bill, her gym membership, and her groceries. I'd done the math. Over 4 years, they'd invested at least $120,000 in Sienna's process of finding herself. I'd paid my own living expenses at MIT, worked summers as a coding instructor and teaching assistant, sent myself care packages, and bought my own used laptop when my old one finally died junior year. I was the easy child, the one who didn't need help, the one they could forget about because I was going to be fine anyway. Graduation day at MIT arrived on a perfect May morning, the kind of day that seemed designed for celebration, with clear blue skies and the sun warm on the back of my black gown as I joined the procession of graduates filing into Killian Court. I found my seat in the rows of chairs arranged in front of the academic stage, surrounded by other computer science majors whose families had arrived days earlier, who'd spent the morning taking photos on the steps of Building 10, whose parents were somewhere in the sea of faces filling the stands with cameras ready and pride visible even from a distance. I'd checked my phone 17 times that morning. Despite knowing better, some desperate part of me hoping for a message that said they'd changed their minds, that they were on a plane, that they'd realized this mattered. Nothing. Just a text from my mother at 7 a.m. that said, "Good luck today," with a balloon emoji, the kind of message you send to someone running a 5K, not graduating with highest honors from MIT. The ceremony stretched across 2 hours, and I watched it happen to me, as though from somewhere outside my body, heard my name called with the summa cum laude designation, walked across that stage, and shook the dean's hand, accepted my diploma cover knowing the real one would come in the mail, and looked out at the crowd trying not to search for faces I knew weren't there. When they called my name, Jennifer, my roommate for the past 3 years, screamed from somewhere in the graduate section. And I heard her family cheering too, the Kowalskis who'd adopted me for holidays when flights home were too expensive, who'd taken me to dinner once a month just to make sure I was eating real food, who'd met me exactly 4 times before today and somehow cared more about this moment than my own parents. After the ceremony ended, after caps were thrown, and everyone flooded toward their families, Jennifer found me standing near the edge of Killian Court, watching reunions happen all around me, and she hugged me hard enough that I felt something crack in my chest, and she said, "Your parents are fucking idiots." And I loved her for saying it out loud. Her mother, Carol, pulled me into their family photos, insisted I stand in the center of one, told me I was brilliant, and they were honored to be there, and I smiled for those pictures while wondering what it said about my life that strangers were more proud of me than my own family. I called my parents at 4 p.m., after the Kowalskis had taken me to lunch, after I'd returned to my dorm room and packed another box, after I'd given myself time to hope they might call first. My mother answered on the third ring, breathless with excitement. "Maya, congratulations. We've been thinking about you all day. How was it?" she asked. And I said it was fine, it was good, and she said, "Oh, wonderful. I'm so glad." And then without pausing, "You should see this place. Sedona is absolutely magical." And Sienna's teacher gave the most incredible talk about intention and purpose. I wish you could have heard it. And tonight, there's a sound bath ceremony that's supposed to be transformative. I listened to her talk for 12 more minutes about red rocks and energy vortexes, and Sienna's certification, and the beautiful dinner they'd had. And when she finally paused and asked if I was celebrating, I told her Jennifer's family had taken me out. And she said, "Oh, that's so nice. See, you had people there. I knew you'd be fine." And something in me that had been cracking all day finally broke clean through. I moved to San Francisco 3 weeks after graduation, with everything I owned packed into 8 boxes and 2 suitcases, drove cross-country in a used Toyota I'd bought for $7,000 with money saved from my campus jobs, and signed a lease on a studio apartment in the Richmond district that cost $2,400 a month and felt simultaneously too expensive and like proof I'd actually made it. My starting salary at Parallax Technologies was $140,000 with a $20,000 signing bonus and stock options that my offer letter said could be worth substantial value if the company continued its growth trajectory, and when I'd signed that offer letter in March, I'd stared at the number until it stopped looking like something that could apply to my life. My parents had said congratulations when I'd told them about the job, the same way they'd said congratulations about graduation, a word that was starting to feel like it meant nothing at all. The apartment was small but mine, fifth floor of a building with bay windows that looked out toward Golden Gate Park, and I'd spent my first weekend building furniture from IKEA and arranging my books on shelves and trying to convince myself that this was what victory felt like, this quiet apartment with no one to share the news with, no one to help me celebrate, just me and my boxes and the sound of foghorns in the distance. The family group chat, which I'd named the Patels years ago in a moment of optimism about family unity, had been quiet during my drive across the country, except for my messages updating my location. But the week I started work, it suddenly came alive with Sienna's news that she was opening her own yoga studio. The messages arrived in a flood. My mother saying she was so proud, my father saying this was exactly the kind of entrepreneurial spirit the family valued, Sienna sending photos of potential locations, all exposed brick and hardwood floors and big windows that would be perfect for morning sun salutations. My mother asked if I was settled in San Francisco, and before I could respond with more than "yes, starting work Monday," Sienna had sent 4 more messages about studio name ideas, and my mother was voting on her favorites. 3 days into my new job, learning the code base and meeting my team and trying to figure out how to be a real engineer instead of a student, my father sent a message to the group chat asking if we could all chip in to help Sienna with startup costs. Maybe $5,000 each to show family support for family dreams. I'd read that message during my lunch break, sitting in Parallax's cafeteria, with its free gourmet food and cold brew on tap, and I'd felt something harden in my chest. I'd responded that I was still getting settled and had a lot of expenses with the move, which was true, and my father had sent back a thumbs up emoji, and no one had pushed. But I'd noticed that Sienna's next message about signing a lease came with a comment about doing it mostly on my own with some help from mom and dad, and I'd understood that I was being marked as the one who didn't contribute. I'd made one friend those first weeks at Parallax, a senior engineer named Lucas Chen, who'd been assigned as my onboarding buddy and who actually took the job seriously, checking in on me every day, inviting me to lunch with his team, asking how I was adjusting to the city. One afternoon in late June, almost a month into the job, we'd gone for coffee at a place near the office, and he'd asked if I was homesick, and something about the way he'd asked it, genuinely curious and without judgment, had made me tell him the truth. I'd said I wasn't homesick at all, that my parents had skipped my graduation for my sister's yoga retreat, and Lucas had stopped walking and stared at me and said, "They what?" And I'd realized it was the first time I'd said it out loud to someone who didn't already know my family, the first time I'd heard how it sounded to someone who had no context for the pattern. He'd said, "Maya, that's fucked up." and I'd felt the same crack in my chest that I'd felt when Jennifer called my parents idiots. The relief of someone else naming the thing I'd been trying to pretend didn't hurt. 3 months into the job, I was exceeding every performance metric my manager tracked, had shipped 2 significant features ahead of schedule, and was already being pulled into architecture discussions, usually reserved for senior engineers, when the message appeared in the family group chat that Sienna's studio, named Lotus Space Wellness, was opening in September with a grand opening celebration that everyone was expected to attend. My mother had sent 12 messages in rapid succession with photos of the space, all sage green walls and bamboo floors, and shelves lined with meditation cushions, and my father had written, "We're so proud to have invested $50,000 in Sienna's dream. This is what family support looks like." And I'd read that number while sitting at my desk and felt something sharp lodge in my throat, because 50K, $1,000 was more than they'd contributed to my entire existence over 4 years at MIT. The grand opening was scheduled for September 15th, a Saturday, and my mother had called me directly to make sure I'd be there, saying, "Sienna really needs her whole family there for this. It's such a big moment for her." And I'd said I'd have to check my work schedule, and she'd said, "Maya, surely you can take one weekend off for your sister," with a tone that made it clear that my job, my life, my work that paid $140,000 a year was somehow less important than a yoga studio opening in our hometown of Pleasanton, California. I'd bought a plane ticket for $340 and booked a room at my parents' house and flown home that Friday night in mid-September, landing at Oakland Airport and driving my rental car across the bay to my childhood home where my mother had hugged me distractedly and immediately asked if I'd brought something nice to wear tomorrow because there would be important people there, local business owners and wellness influencers and potential investors. The grand opening itself was held from 2 to 6 p.m., and the studio space was packed with at least 80 people drinking kombucha and green juice, taking selfies in front of the lotus flower mural Sienna had commissioned, signing up for intro class packages that my sister was offering at a discount. And I'd stood near the refreshment table watching my parents work the room with an energy I'd never seen them direct toward anything involving me. My father had introduced Sienna to a couple I didn't recognize as our success story. She followed her passion, and we couldn't be prouder. And when the couple had noticed me standing there and asked who I was, my father had said, "Oh, that's our younger daughter Maya. She works with computers in San Francisco." And the dismissiveness in that phrase, "works with computers," as though I were doing data entry instead of engineering machine learning infrastructure at a Series C startup, had made me grip my kombucha bottle hard enough that the plastic crackled. My mother had spent the entire event at Sienna's side, taking photos and introducing her to everyone. And the one time she'd brought someone over to meet me, a woman named Deborah, who apparently owned a Pilates studio in Walnut Creek, she'd said, "Maya's very smart, she went to MIT, but Sienna's the one with the real vision for wellness and community." And I'd smiled and nodded and made small talk and felt my resolve crystallizing into something hard and permanent. A decision I hadn't quite made yet, but could feel myself approaching with each casual dismissal, each reminder that in my family's eyes, I would always be the daughter who didn't need celebration because my achievements were expected rather than remarkable. I flew back to San Francisco the day after Sienna's grand opening and walked into the Parallax offices on Monday morning with a clarity I hadn't felt before, a decision made somewhere in the space between watching my father call my sister their success story and sitting alone on the plane ride home, and I threw myself into work with an intensity that my manager Sarah noticed within a week, asking if everything was okay, and I'd told her everything was fine. I just wanted to make the most of the opportunities here. In October, I was assigned as technical lead on a major infrastructure migration project, moving our entire data pipeline to a new architecture that would reduce latency by 40% and cut costs by $2 million annually. And I'd spent 6 weeks working 12-hour days, coordinating with teams across the company, writing design documents and leading meetings and reviewing code, barely checking my phone except to see the family group chat filling with messages I didn't read. The family group chat had become background noise I'd learned to ignore, notifications I'd see and swipe away, though I'd catch glimpses sometimes of Sienna's messages about her studio, photos of sparsely attended classes, and comments about how she was building community slowly and focusing on quality over quantity, and my mother's encouraging responses that felt increasingly strained. By December, 6 months after graduation, Sarah called me into her office and told me I was being promoted to senior software engineer, effective January 1st, with a salary increase to $185,000 and an additional stock option grant that, given our company's trajectory, could be worth $200,000 or more when they vested, and she'd said I'd earned it through both my technical skills and my leadership on the migration project, that I had a real future here, and I'd thanked her and walked back to my desk and sat there for 5 minutes just breathing, because this was the kind of recognition I'd been working toward my entire life, and there was no one from my family to tell. I'd called Lucas and he'd taken me out for celebratory drinks that night, and I'd finally let myself look at the family group chat while we sat at the bar, scrolling back through 2 months of messages I'd ignored, and the tone had shifted in ways that made my stomach tighten. Sienna's messages had gone from enthusiastic to defensive, talking about how her studio offered something that couldn't be measured in capitalist terms, how she was building authentic connections and creating sacred space, and how some people understood that energy exchange was more valuable than money, and my parents' responses had shifted from encouraging to concerned. My mother asking about membership numbers, and my father asking if she'd looked into the marketing consultation he'd suggested. There were no messages asking how I was doing, how my job was going, whether I'd adjusted to San Francisco or made friends or done anything worth celebrating. I was watching my sister's dream fail in real time through a group chat where I existed only as a silent observer. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, something that sat uneasily alongside my anger and hurt. I felt sad for her, for the inevitability of what was coming, even as I recognized that I had no obligation to prevent it, that this crisis had been built by choices I hadn't made and expectations I'd never set, and that for the first time in my life, I was going to be the one who succeeded while Sienna was the one who struggled, and my parents were going to have to reconcile themselves to that reality whether they wanted to or not. My mother called on a Thursday evening in late January while I was making dinner in my apartment, and I'd seen her name on my phone screen and considered not answering before deciding that avoidance wouldn't work forever, and when I picked up she'd skipped past any greeting to say, "Maya, honey, I need to talk to you about something important. Do you have a few minutes?" And I'd said yes while turning down the heat on my stove, and she'd launched into an explanation that took 3 minutes of preamble before getting to the actual request, talking about how Sienna had worked so hard on the studio, and how the wellness industry was difficult, and how sometimes businesses needed time to find their footing, and finally she'd said, "We're wondering if you could loan Sienna $15,000 just to get through the next few months until her membership numbers improve." And the specific amount had hung in the air between us, while I'd stood in my kitchen looking out at the San Francisco skyline and feeling something settle into place, a clarity that made my next words easier than I'd expected. "I can't do that, Mom," I'd said calmly, and she'd gone quiet for a moment before saying, "Can't or won't," with an edge in her voice, and I'd said, "Won't. I'm saving for a down payment on a condo. I have financial goals of my own," and I'd heard her exhale in a way that communicated disappointment more effectively than words before she'd said, "Maya, this is your sister. She needs help. Surely you can spare 15,000 when you're making so much money now." And the way she'd said "so much money" had carried a judgment I couldn't quite name, as though my salary was something vaguely distasteful rather than something I'd earned through 4 years at MIT and 7 months of 12-hour days. "I understand she needs help," I'd said, "but I'm not in a position to loan that amount right now." Which wasn't true, but was easier than explaining that I was absolutely in a position to loan it and was choosing not to, And then I'd heard my father's voice in the background, and my mother had said, "Hold on, your father wants to talk to you." And there'd been a shuffling sound before my father's voice had come through, saying, "Maya, your mother tells me you're refusing to help your sister." And I'd said, "I'm not refusing to help, I'm just not able to loan $15,000 right now." And he'd said, "That's the same thing. And frankly, I'm disappointed. Family helps family. That's what we do. We invested $50,000 in Sienna's dream because we believe in supporting our children, and now we're asking you to do the same." And I'd felt anger rising in my throat at the comparison, at the idea that their investment in Sienna's failing business was equivalent to asking me to throw my money into the same fire. "You gave Sienna $50,000, I'd said, keeping my voice level. "You're asking me to loan $15,000. Those aren't the same thing, and I have my own financial priorities." And my father had said, "You make $140,000 a year, Maya. You're telling me you can't spare $15,000 to keep your sister's business alive." And I'd wanted to say that I actually made $185,000 now, but that he wouldn't know that, because he'd never asked about my promotion, and instead I'd said, "I'm sorry, but my answer is no." And there'd been a long silence before my father had said, "I hope you can live with yourself knowing you let your sister fail when you could have helped." And he'd hung up before I could respond, and I'd stood there holding my phone and shaking slightly, and within 5 minutes the texts had started, first from my mother saying, "Very disappointed in your selfishness tonight," and then 10 minutes later from Sienna saying, "Thanks for nothing, really showed your true colors, guess money changed you." And I'd put my phone face down on the counter and tried to finish making dinner, but my hands were shaking too hard to chop vegetables properly. And I'd finally ordered takeout and spent the evening sitting on my couch feeling guilty and angry and liberated all at once, wondering if I'd just permanently damaged my relationship with my family, and simultaneously knowing that if I had, it was a relationship that had been broken long before tonight. The family group chat became a minefield I checked obsessively, even though I knew I shouldn't. Watching messages appear throughout that weekend and into the following week, my mother's responses to anything I wrote now clipped and cold where they'd been warm before. Single-word answers like fine or okay when I'd share something about work, while Sienna's messages had taken on a passive-aggressive quality that made my chest tight every time I saw the notifications. Posts about how she was learning who her real family was, and how some people valued money over relationships, and how capitalism had poisoned even blood bonds. And I'd wanted to respond, wanted to defend myself, wanted to scream that I'd worked 3 jobs during college while they'd paid her rent and car insurance and credit card bills. But I'd said nothing, just watched the performance of my own villainy play out in a group chat I couldn't leave without making everything worse. I'd finally talked to Lucas about it over lunch on a Tuesday, showing him the messages and watching his face darken as he read through them, and he'd said, "Maya, this is emotional manipulation. You know that, right?" And I'd said I knew, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. And he'd asked me how much money my parents had given Sienna over the years, and I'd started calculating out loud and realized it was probably close to $150,000 when you added up rent payments and car payments and the business investment and all the smaller bailouts over the years. And Lucas had stared at me and said, "And they never asked you if you needed anything." And I'd shaken my head and felt tears starting and pushed them back because I was at work and couldn't fall apart in the cafeteria. That evening, I'd opened the family group chat one more time and scrolled back through 2 years of messages, looking for any instance of my parents asking about my life the way they asked about Sienna's, any offer of support or interest or celebration, and I'd found my graduation announcement with 3 responses. "Congratulations" from my mother, "Proud of you" from my father, and "That's great, sis" from Sienna, before the conversation had immediately shifted to Sienna's yoga certification timeline, and I'd found my new job announcement with similar brief acknowledgments, before a long thread about whether Sienna should lease or buy equipment for her studio. And I'd closed the app and gone to settings and muted the entire conversation because I couldn't keep doing this to myself, couldn't keep seeking evidence of my own invisibility. I started going to therapy myself in February, finding a counselor named Dr. Chen who specialized in family dynamics. And in our first session, when she'd asked why I was there, I'd said, I need to figure out if I'm the selfish person my family thinks I am, or if I'm finally setting healthy boundaries. And she'd smiled sadly and said those two things weren't mutually exclusive to family systems that relied on one person staying small. And over the next few weeks, she'd helped me see patterns I'd normalized, helped me understand that being low maintenance wasn't a virtue I'd chosen but a role I'd been assigned, and that refusing to fund my sister's failing business wasn't cruelty but basic self-preservation. By March, I'd started dating someone, a software engineer named Ryan who worked at a different company, but whom I'd met at a tech networking event. And on our third date, when he'd asked about my family, I'd given him the abbreviated version and watched his face carefully for signs that he thought I was the problem. And instead, he'd said, "They didn't come to your MIT graduation," with such genuine disbelief that I'd felt something loosen in my chest, felt the validation of someone who could see clearly what my family had made murky. And I'd said no, they hadn't, and he'd reached across the table and taken my hand and said, "I'm sorry, that must have hurt so much." And I'd realized those were words my parents had never said, an acknowledgement of pain they'd never offered. And I'd known then that I was done making myself smaller to make them comfortable. Done setting myself on fire to keep Sienna warm, and in April I'd started seriously looking at condos in San Francisco, meeting with a real estate agent and getting pre-approved for a mortgage, building a life that belonged entirely to me. And when I'd finally put an offer on a one-bedroom in Noe Valley with morning light and a view of the city, I'd posted about it in the muted family group chat more as a formality than a genuine sharing. And my mother had responded, "That's nice, dear," and my father hadn't responded at all, and I'd felt nothing, which was its own kind of progress. The phone call came in late July, 4 months after I'd muted the family group chat, and 3 weeks after I'd closed on my condo, and I'd been hanging artwork in my living room when my mother's name appeared on my screen, and I'd almost declined it before deciding that whatever came next, I needed to face it rather than avoid it. And when I answered, her voice had sounded strained, in a way I'd never heard before, as she said, "Maya, we need to talk. Can you come home for Thanksgiving?" And I'd said, "That's 4 months away. What's going on?" And there'd been a long pause before she'd said, "Sienna's studio closed last week. We lost everything we invested, and we need to have a family meeting about some financial decisions." And I'd felt my stomach drop, not from sympathy, but from the certainty that I knew exactly what kind of financial decisions she meant. And I'd said, "How much did you lose total?" And she'd said, "That's something we should discuss in person as a family," which was answer enough. And I'd agreed to come home for Thanksgiving because I'd known this conversation was inevitable, and at least this way I'd have 4 months to prepare for it. I'd told Lucas the next day at work, and watched him close his eyes and shake his head before saying, "They're going to ask you for money. You know that, right? Probably a lot of money." And I'd said I knew, and he'd spent our entire lunch break coaching me on how to hold boundaries, how to separate their emergency from my obligation, how to say no without drowning in guilt. And I'd listened and taken notes on my phone like I was preparing for a presentation, which in a way I was, the most important presentation of my life. Over the next 4 months, I'd thought about that upcoming Thanksgiving constantly, playing out scenarios in my mind while I wrote code or rode the Muni or lay awake next to Ryan, imagining what they'd say and what I'd say back. And I'd talked it through in therapy with Dr. Chen, who'd helped me identify my non-negotiables and practice stating them calmly. And I'd felt myself becoming harder in a way that hurt, but also felt necessary, like I was building armor I should have constructed years ago. In October, my mother had called again to confirm I was coming and to mention casually that they'd had to remortgage the house and that my father was worried about retirement. And I'd said, "Mom, how much money are we talking about?" And she'd said, "We can discuss everything at Thanksgiving." And I'd known then that it was worse than I'd imagined, that the number would be big enough that they couldn't say it over the phone, and I'd started drafting a loan agreement document on my laptop late one night, writing out terms and interest rates and repayment schedules, and Ryan had found me doing it at 2 in the morning and asked what I was working on. And when I'd explained, he'd read over my shoulder and said, "You're really going to loan them money?" And I'd said, "Maybe, but only on my terms, only if they can acknowledge what they've done." And he'd kissed the top of my head and said, "You're stronger than they ever gave you credit for." And I'd saved the document and continued refining it over the following weeks, preparing for a confrontation I knew would either rebuild my family or end it entirely. I drove up on Thanksgiving morning because I couldn't bear the thought of spending the night before in that house, and when I pulled into the driveway at 11, the front door opened before I'd even turned off the engine, and my mother stood there with an expression I'd never seen before, something between relief and desperation, and she hugged me too tightly when I reached the porch and said, "Thank you for coming. We've missed you so much." Which would have meant more if the missing had manifested any time in the past year when I wasn't needed for something. The house smelled like turkey and tension, that particular combination of holiday cooking and unspoken crisis, and Sienna was at the kitchen table with red-rimmed eyes and no makeup, looking younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her since high school, and she said, "Hey," without meeting my gaze, and I said, "Hey," back, and felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on the room. My father came in from the garage where he'd clearly been hiding and shook my hand formally like I was a business associate rather than his daughter, and he said, "Maya, good to see you. How was the drive?" And I said, "Fine. Traffic wasn't bad." And we stood there in this parody of normal family gathering, while the real conversation waited like a third rail none of us wanted to touch yet. We made it through dinner with stilted small talk, my mother asking about my condo, and then not really listening to my answers, Sienna pushing food around her plate and sighing periodically, my father eating mechanically and refilling his wine glass 3 times. And I felt like I was watching us from outside my body, seeing how broken we'd become, how we'd never learned to be a family that talked about hard things, because we'd spent my whole life pretending the hard things didn't exist. Finally, after my mother had cleared the plates and brought out coffee that no one wanted, my father folded his hands on the table and said, "Maya, I'm sure your mother told you we needed to discuss some things, and I appreciate you coming home for this." And I nodded and waited because I'd learned in negotiations at work that whoever speaks first usually loses. And after a long pause, he continued, "Sienna's studio closed in July, which you probably know, and the investments we made didn't pan out, and we found ourselves in a difficult financial position." I watched my mother reach over and take Sienna's hand, watched my sister's face crumple slightly, and I kept my own face neutral as I said, "How difficult?" And my father cleared his throat and said, "We invested $80,000 in the studio over 18 months, and with the remortgage on the house and some other debts we've accumulated helping Sienna get established over the years, we're looking at a shortfall of about $200,000 for a comfortable retirement." And the number hung in the air between us, enormous and somehow exactly what I'd expected, and my mother added quickly, "We're not asking you to cover all of it, of course. We just thought that as a family we could come up with a plan, and you're doing so well now with your job and everything." And I felt something sharp and hot rise in my chest as I understood that this was it. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. And I said, "What kind of plan did you have in mind?" And my father said, "Well, we were hoping you might be able to help us with a significant portion, maybe even 100,000, just to get us back on stable ground, and we'd pay you back, of course." And Sienna spoke for the first time, her voice small, saying, "I'm so sorry, Maya. I never wanted this to happen. I really thought the studio would work." And I looked at her and saw genuine distress, and also the familiar pattern of her creating chaos and everyone else cleaning it up. And I took a breath and said, "Let's talk about what help actually looks like." I set my coffee cup down carefully and looked at each of them in turn before saying, "Before we talk about what I can do for you, I need to talk about what you've done to me." And my mother's face shifted into that familiar expression of pained confusion, while my father's jaw tightened, and I continued. "You didn't come to my MIT graduation, the biggest achievement of my life, because you were at Sienna's yoga instructor certification celebration in Sedona. And my mother started to say, Maya, we explained that the dates, but I held up my hand and said, I'm not finished. I sat alone at my graduation, summa cum laude, 4 years of perfect grades and groundbreaking research, and you were taking sunset photos at a resort. And the words were coming faster now, 22 years of swallowed feelings finally given voice, and I said, when I was 12, I won the regional spelling bee, and you missed the finals because Sienna had an art show. When I was valedictorian, you spent my graduation dinner talking about Sienna's boyfriend problems. When I got a full scholarship to MIT, you were upset because it meant Sienna would be lonely with me gone, and I watched my mother's face crumple and my father lean back in his chair, and Sienna said, Maya, come on, we're talking about real problems right now, and something hot and sharp flared in my chest as I turned to her and said, these are real problems. My problems have always been real, even if none of you bothered to notice them. And my father said, that's not fair. We've always been proud of you. And I laughed, actually laughed, and said, proud enough to introduce me as works with computers while calling Sienna your success story. Proud enough to ask me for money, but not proud enough to attend the most important day of my life. My mother was crying now, saying, we thought you understood. Sienna needed us more. You were always so capable, so independent. And I said, I was independent because I had no choice, because every time I needed something, you were busy with Sienna's latest crisis. And I pulled out my phone and opened the notes I'd been keeping, the documentation I'd compiled over the past 4 months, and I said, let's talk about money since that's why I'm here. You've given Sienna approximately $150,000 over the past 8 years. I have receipts, first and last month's rent when she moved to Portland, $7,000, car down payment when she totaled hers, $12,000, credit card debt payoff, $18,000, living expenses while she found herself in Bali, $23,000, business loan for the failed jewelry venture, $15,000, studio investment, $80,000, and dozens of smaller amounts for emergencies and opportunities and dreams. And my father said, we're her parents. We were helping her. And I said, you're my parent too. I paid my own living expenses at MIT, worked 20 hours a week while taking the hardest course load in the country, graduated with $8,000 in debt that I paid off myself, and you never once offered help because I had a scholarship, so I must not need anything. Sienna stood up abruptly and said, this is unbelievable. We're in crisis and you're making it about yourself. You're being so selfish. And I looked at her and felt a clarity I'd never experienced before as I said, I'm being selfish. I worked my whole life while you drifted from dream to dream on our parents' money, and now that your choices have consequences, suddenly I'm the bad guy for not fixing it. And my mother said, Maya, please, you don't understand how hard it's been for your sister. She's struggled with anxiety and finding her path. And I said, and I didn't struggle. Is that what you think? You think MIT was easy. You think being brilliant enough to get in, but poor enough to need scholarships was simple. You think watching my roommate's family celebrate her while I sat alone didn't hurt. And my voice cracked on the last word, but I pushed through and said, every dollar you gave Sienna was a vote for her mattering more than me. Every event you missed was a message that my achievements weren't worth your time. And now you want $100,000 like I owe it to you, like family means I erase your choices. The silence after my words stretched for several seconds before my father cleared his throat and said, Maya, I understand you're hurt, but your education is its own reward. You have a degree from MIT that will open every door. You're going to make millions over your career, and we're asking you to help your family in a time of genuine crisis. And the familiar reasoning washed over me, the same logic that had justified every dismissal, every absence, every choice that put Sienna first. And I felt something settle in my chest as I said, I will help you, but not the way you want, not as a gift, and not without conditions. And my mother leaned forward, with sudden hope in her eyes, while my father's expression became wary, and I continued, I'll loan you $100,000 at 6% interest with a structured 5-year repayment plan. monthly installments of approximately $2,000. And in addition to the loan, I require that we all attend family therapy to address the patterns that led us here. And the hope in my mother's face transformed to shock as she said, "You want us to pay you interest, Maya? We're your parents." And my father said, "This is insulting. We're not a bank transaction. We're talking about family helping family." And I said, "Yes, we are talking about family. And you've taught me exactly how this family works. You help Sienna unconditionally. And you expect me to help everyone unconditionally while receiving nothing in return. So if we're going to pretend this is about family values, then let's examine whose family has actually been valued." Sienna stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor and said, "Are you serious right now? They need help and you're going to charge them interest like some kind of loan shark? Do you understand how heartless that is? Do you even hear yourself?" And her voice was rising toward hysteria, while my mother reached for her hand, and I looked at my sister and said, "I hear myself perfectly. I'm offering $100,000, which is more than they gave me in my entire life. And I'm structuring it as a loan because that's honest. That's what this is. You need my money, and you're willing to have a relationship with me to get it." And my father said, "That's not true. We love you, Maya. We've always loved you." And I said, "Then prove it. Go to therapy. Examine why one daughter got $150,000 for dreams, while the other daughter got nothing for achievements. Look at why you missed my graduation. Really look at it. And if you can do that work, then I'll help you financially." My mother was crying harder now, saying, "We can't afford therapy. We're in a financial crisis. That's the whole point." And I said, "The therapy is non-negotiable, and I'll cover the cost of it. That's separate from the loan. But you have to actually participate. You have to show up and do the work." And my father said, "You want us to pay you interest and go to therapy and what, apologize for loving your sister? Is that what this is about?" And I felt my control slipping slightly as I said, "It's about acknowledgement. It's about you seeing that your choices had consequences, that I mattered too, that my life and my accomplishments and my graduation deserved the same attention you gave to Sienna's yoga certification." And Sienna said, "I can't believe you're holding that over them. I can't believe you're this petty. They're going to lose their house, Maya. They're going to have nothing for retirement, and you're playing power games." And I looked at her and said, "I'm setting boundaries for the first time in my life, and you're calling it petty because you've never had to hear the word no." I stood up from my chair and felt a strange steadiness in my legs, despite my hands trembling slightly as I said, "I'm going to explain this once more, and then I'm leaving. So please listen carefully." And the room went very quiet, except for my mother's soft crying. And I continued, "You taught me how this family works. You taught me that love is conditional, that attention goes to whoever needs it most, that my achievements don't matter as much as Sienna's struggles, and now I'm applying those lessons." And I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder I'd prepared, the one I'd spent hours assembling in my San Francisco apartment with Lucas sitting beside me telling me I wasn't crazy for doing this, and I placed it on the table and said, "This is a loan contract, $100,000 at 6% interest with a 5-year repayment term, monthly payments of $1,933.28, first payment due January 1st. And I watched my father's face turn red as he said, "You actually had this drawn up. You came here planning this." And I said, "Yes, I came prepared because I knew exactly how this conversation would go. I knew you'd ask for money, and I knew you'd expect me to hand it over because that's what I do. I'm the dependable one, the one who doesn't make waves. But I'm making waves now." My mother reached for the folder with shaking hands and opened it, and I saw her eyes scan the official letterhead from the attorney I'd hired to draft it. And she said, "Maya, this is so formal. This isn't how family works." And I said, "You're right. This isn't how family works. Family shows up for graduations. Family doesn't introduce one daughter as their success story while dismissing the other daughter's career. Family doesn't give $150,000 to one child and nothing to the other, But this is how business works, and you've made it clear that our relationship is a business arrangement where I'm the bank. And Sienna said, I cannot believe you're doing this. They raised you, they gave you everything. And I looked at her and said, they gave you everything. They gave me a place to sleep until I left for college, and I'm not obligated to bankrupt myself fixing a crisis I didn't create. I didn't tell you to open a yoga studio. I didn't tell them to invest their retirement savings in your dream. I didn't make any of these choices, but somehow I'm the villain for not paying for them. I pushed the folder closer to my father and said, the terms are non-negotiable. $100,000 loan with the interest rate and repayment schedule outlined in the contract, plus mandatory family therapy, which I will pay for separately. And if those terms aren't acceptable, then I'm not helping at all. And my father said, so that's it. You're going to let us lose the house if we don't agree to be charged interest by our own daughter. And I said, you're not going to lose the house. You remortgaged it, which means you have equity and you have options. You're going to be uncomfortable and you're going to have to make sacrifices, the way I made sacrifices, working 20 hours a week at MIT. And yes, if you want my help, it comes with terms because I'm worth that. My money is worth that. And I'm not lighting myself on fire to keep you warm anymore. My mother was reading through the contract now, her tears falling onto the pages, and she said, there's a clause here about what happens if we miss a payment. And I said, yes, standard default terms. If you miss 2 consecutive payments, the full balance becomes due immediately. This is a real contract because I'm treating this as a real loan. And you can take it to any attorney and they'll tell you the terms are fair, more than fair actually, because I'm not requiring collateral. And my father stood up and said, I can't believe you're doing this. I can't believe you treat us this way. And I felt something break loose in my chest as I said, I can't believe you missed my graduation. I can't believe you chose Sienna's yoga certification over MIT. I can't believe you're asking me for money and calling me heartless in the same conversation. But here we are. I picked up my purse and said, I'm staying at the Hilton on Morrison Street, room 314. You have until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to decide if you want to sign the contract. If you agree, then we'll sign, and I'll transfer the money immediately. If you don't agree, then I'm going back to San Francisco, and we can all move forward with the relationship we actually have, instead of pretending we're something we're not. And Sienna said, if you walk out that door, you're walking out on this family. And I said, no. I'm walking out on being treated like an ATM that's supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to be used. And I turned toward the door while my mother said, Maya, please, can't we just talk about this? But I was already moving, already grabbing my coat from the hook by the door, already stepping out into the cold November evening, while behind me I heard my father say something angry and my sister's voice rise to a shout. The drive to the hotel took 12 minutes, and I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and twice I had to pull over because my vision blurred with tears. And by the time I pulled into the hotel parking garage, I was shaking so hard I could barely turn off the ignition. I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes in the concrete darkness while the engine ticked as it cooled, and I let myself cry the way I hadn't let myself cry at that dinner table. Huge gasping sobs that felt like they were tearing something out of my chest. And I thought about my graduation day, about sitting alone in those empty seats while Jennifer's family cheered for her, about coming back to my dorm room and seeing the care package Jennifer's mother had left for me because she knew my parents hadn't come. And I cried harder because even a stranger had seen I deserved better than what my own family gave me. I checked into my hotel room and sat on the edge of the perfectly made bed and stared at my phone as it started buzzing with notifications, and the first text was from my Aunt Karen saying, Your mother called me crying. How could you treat them this way when they need you? And then my cousin Derek wrote, Heard you're charging your parents interest. That's messed up, Maya. And I watched the messages pile up from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, all of them suddenly very concerned about family values, and I realized my mother must have called everyone to paint me as the villain. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was a screenshot from Lucas showing Sienna's Instagram story, a photo of a sunset with text overlay reading, "Sometimes the people you do anything for won't do the bare minimum for you, learning who really shows up." And I felt a bitter laugh escape my throat, because the irony was so thick I could choke on it. And I wanted to comment asking her where she was on May 20th, when I graduated summa cum laude from MIT, but I didn't because engaging would only feed the narrative she was building. I scrolled through more messages, my Uncle Tom asking if I was seriously abandoning family over money. My grandmother's neighbor, Sandra, who I'd met exactly once, telling me that blood is thicker than water. And I felt the familiar guilt creeping in, the old programming that said I was being selfish, that good daughters don't set boundaries, that asking for basic respect was somehow cruel. My phone rang and I saw Ryan's name and answered it, and his voice was warm as he said, "How did it go?" And I started crying again as I said, "Exactly like I knew it would. They're angry and hurt and they think I'm a monster." And he said, "Tell me everything." And I did. I told him about the contract and the interest rate and the therapy requirement and my sister's explosion and walking out. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying, "I'm proud of you. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I'm really proud of you for standing up for yourself." We talked for almost an hour, and his support felt like a lifeline. And after we hung up, I saw a text from Lucas saying, "You did the right thing. Don't let them gaslight you into thinking otherwise. You offered them more than they deserved and set reasonable boundaries." And I read his message 3 times and felt some of the guilt start to loosen its grip. I ordered room service because I couldn't face going to a restaurant with my eyes swollen from crying. And while I waited for the food, I sat at the small desk and opened my laptop and looked at my bank account, at the number that represented years of hard work and sacrifice and being invisible. And I thought about how my parents saw that number as something I owed them, as if my success existed to subsidize their failures. The food arrived and I ate mechanically while scrolling through my photos, and I stopped on one from graduation day, me in my cap and gown with Jennifer and her family, and I remembered how her mother had hugged me and said, "Your parents must be so proud," and how I'd smiled and said, "Yeah, they are," because admitting the truth felt like admitting I wasn't worth showing up for. I thought about the contract sitting on my parents' dining room table, about whether they'd sign it or let their pride cost them the help they desperately needed, and I realized that whatever they decided would tell me everything I needed to know about whether our relationship could be salvaged, and I felt scared and liberated in equal measure, because for the first time in my life I wasn't accommodating their choices, I was making them accommodate mine. Sleep came in fits and starts, and every time I woke up, I checked my phone hoping for a message from my parents that showed understanding, but there was nothing. Just more texts from relatives and another Instagram story from Sienna, this one a quote about narcissism that was clearly directed at me. And I lay in the dark hotel room listening to the distant sound of traffic and thought about the fact that standing up for yourself looks like cruelty to people who benefited from you sitting down. My phone rang at 7:43 in the morning, and I jerked awake in the hotel bed, disoriented for a moment before I remembered where I was and why, and I saw my father's name on the screen and my heart started pounding as I answered with a cautious, "Hello?" And his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it as he said, "Can you come back to the house? Your mother and I would like to talk to you." And I said, "Is this about the contract?" And he said, "Yes, we've read it. We've talked about it. Please just come." And something in his tone was different, not angry, but almost defeated, and I said, "I'll be there in 30 minutes." I showered quickly and dressed in the same clothes from yesterday, and the drive back to my childhood home felt surreal in the morning light, and I noticed details I'd missed in the darkness the night before, the way the neighborhood had aged, the houses that needed paint, the trees that had grown taller, and I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to earn love from people who treated it like a limited resource that had to be rationed. I pulled into the driveway at 8:17 and sat in my car for a moment, gathering my courage, and I could see my mother's silhouette in the kitchen window, And I remembered standing in that same kitchen at 16, telling them I'd gotten a full scholarship to MIT, and my father saying, "That's wonderful, honey," before immediately turning to ask Sienna about her college applications, even though she'd already said she wasn't going to college. I walked to the front door and let myself in, and my parents were sitting at the kitchen table with the contract between them, and my mother's eyes were red and swollen, and my father looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight, and I noticed immediately that Sienna wasn't there, and my mother said, "She's at Rebecca's house. We thought it would be better to talk just the three of us." And I sat down across from them and waited. My father cleared his throat and said, "We've read through this contract multiple times. We even called Alan Morrison to look at it, and Alan was their attorney." And he continued, "Alan said the terms are more than fair. He said most people would charge more interest or require collateral, and your mother and I have been up all night talking about everything you said yesterday." And my mother reached across the table like she wanted to take my hand, but stopped herself. And she said, "Maya, I've been thinking about your graduation, about Sienna's certification weekend, and I'm starting to see that maybe we made the wrong choice." And I felt something crack in my chest because maybe and starting to see weren't the same as real acknowledgement, but they were more than I'd ever gotten before. My father looked down at the contract and said, "Can you explain this clause about family therapy? Why is that a requirement for the loan?" And I took a deep breath and said, "Because giving you money doesn't fix what's broken between us. It just puts a band-aid on years of damage, and I'm not interested in pretending everything is fine when it isn't. And if we're going to have any kind of relationship going forward, it needs to be built on honesty, which means we need help working through the patterns that got us here." And my mother said, "What patterns? We've always loved you." And I said, "I know you love me. But love and favoritism can coexist. Love and neglect can coexist. And I need you to understand that missing my MIT graduation to go to Sienna's yoga certification wasn't one mistake. It was the culmination of 22 years of choices that told me I didn't matter as much as she did." My mother pulled her hand back and looked at my father, and something passed between them, some silent conversation that married people have without words. And my father said, "We never thought of it that way. You were always so independent. Even when you were little, you never asked for help with homework or wanted us to come to things. You just handled everything yourself." And I felt the frustration rising in my throat as I said, "I was 8 years old when I stopped asking you to come to my science fairs. Do you know why I stopped? Because the first 3 years you said you'd come and then didn't, because something came up with Sienna. So I learned to stop asking, because asking and being disappointed hurt more than not asking at all." And my mother's face crumpled and she said, "I don't remember that." And I said, "I know you don't. That's part of the problem. These moments that shaped my entire childhood were so insignificant to you that they didn't even register. But I remember every single one of them." My father shifted in his chair and said, "Sienna was always struggling. She needed more support. She had anxiety and depression, and she couldn't handle things the way you could. And we thought we were doing the right thing by giving her extra attention. We thought you understood that." And I said, "I was a child. I shouldn't have had to understand that love is rationed based on need. And even if that was your reasoning, then what about now? I'm an adult, and you still chose her yoga certification over my MIT graduation. You still called me to ask for money for her studio while barely asking about my life. You still introduced her as your success story while I was just the daughter who works with computers." And my mother said, "We are proud of you, Maya. We've always been proud of you." And I said, "Then why have you never shown it? Why have I spent my entire life watching you celebrate her and accommodate her and fund her dreams while treating my accomplishments like they're just expected, like they don't count, because they came easily to me?" My mother started crying harder and said, "They did come easily to you. You got straight A's without trying. You got into MIT on a full scholarship. You got a job that pays more than your father and I ever made combined. And Sienna struggled with everything. She barely graduated high school. She couldn't hold down jobs. We were terrified she'd end up homeless or worse. So yes, we gave her more support because she needed it more. And I felt something shift in my chest because this was the closest they'd ever come to admitting the truth. And I said, I understand that you were scared for her, but being low maintenance doesn't mean I didn't need you. It just means I learned early not to expect you to show up. And my graduation was one day, one single day, where I wanted you there to see me accomplish something that mattered to me, and you chose her again. And that told me everything I needed to know about where I rank in this family. The kitchen was silent, except for my mother's quiet crying, and my father looked down at the contract and said, The therapy requirement, if we agree to it, what does that look like? And I said, We find a family therapist who specializes in these dynamics. We commit to at least 6 months of regular sessions. We all show up and participate honestly, including Sienna if she's willing, and we work through these patterns so they don't continue to poison our relationship. And my mother said, And if we do this, if we sign the contract and go to therapy and pay back the loan, can things go back to how they were? And I said, No, because how things were is what broke us. But maybe we can build something new that's actually healthy, where I don't feel invisible, and you don't take my strength for granted, and we all learn to communicate without resentment. My father looked at the contract again and then at my mother, and she nodded slightly and he said, If we agree to the therapy, if we commit to working on this, you'll transfer the money today. And I said, Yes. As soon as we both sign and get it notarized, I can do a wire transfer this afternoon. And my mother said, The interest rate, 6%, that seems high for family. And I felt myself tense but kept my voice steady as I said, It's actually below market rate for an unsecured personal loan. Most banks would charge 8 to 10%. And I'm not requiring collateral even though the amount warrants it. And honestly, the interest isn't really the point. The point is that this is a loan with clear terms and expectations, not a gift that gets held over anyone's head or forgotten about when it's convenient. And my father nodded slowly and said, you're right, we need to treat this properly. And he picked up a pen from the table and said, Where do we sign? I showed them the signature lines and explained each section one more time. The principal amount of $100,000, the interest rate of 6% annually, the repayment schedule of monthly payments over 5 years, the therapy requirement of minimum 6 months with documented attendance, and the clause that said missed payments would accelerate the full amount due. And my mother hesitated before signing and said, Maya, after we do this, after we sign and go to therapy and work on everything, do you think you can forgive us? And I said, I think forgiveness is something that happens over time, not in one moment, and I think it requires real change, not just words. But I'm here, aren't I? I'm giving you this chance when I could have just walked away. So yes, I think eventually I can forgive you if you show me that you're really willing to change. They both signed at 9:42 in the morning, and I called Alan Morrison and asked if he could come notarize the document, and he arrived 30 minutes later looking uncomfortable because he'd known me since I was a child, and this clearly pained him to witness. But he notarized all 3 signatures without comment and left quickly. I opened my banking app and initiated a wire transfer for $100,000 to my parents' joint account, and my father watched the screen as I entered the amount and confirmed the transfer. And something in his expression shifted when he realized I actually had that much money available to transfer immediately. Like it finally hit him that his daughter, who worked with computers, was more successful than he'd bothered to understand. My mother said, It will arrive today, and I said, Within 2 hours usually. And she started crying again and said, Thank you, Maya. We'll pay you back every penny, I promise. And I said, I know you will. It's in writing now. And I heard the front door open and Sienna's voice calling out, Are they still here? Did they leave yet? And she walked into the kitchen, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and her face went pale when she saw the signed contract on the table. She looked at our parents and said, You didn't. Tell me you didn't sign that. And my father said, Sienna, we talked about this. We need the money, and Maya's terms are fair. And Sienna said, fair. She's charging you interest. She's making you go to therapy like you're broken. She's treating you like a bank instead of like parents. And my mother said, she is treating us like we treated her, and maybe we deserve that. And Sienna turned to me with fury in her eyes and said, you're really going to do this. You're going to hold money over their heads and force them into therapy and act like you're the victim when you have everything and I've lost everything. And I stood up and said, I'm not doing this with you right now. The contract is signed, the money is transferred, and whether you participate in therapy or not is up to you, but I'm done being your scapegoat. And I picked up my copy of the contract and walked toward the door. Sienna called after me as I left, but I didn't turn around. And I heard my father telling her to let me go. And I drove back to the hotel with my hands shaking on the steering wheel and the signed contract on the passenger seat beside me, feeling both heavy and weightless at the same time. I flew back to San Francisco that afternoon, and the physical distance felt necessary and healing, like I could finally breathe properly again after spending days in a house that had suffocated me my entire life. 2 weeks later, I got an email from Dr. Patricia Chen, a family therapist in Portland who specialized in sibling dynamics and parental favoritism, saying my parents had reached out to schedule sessions and asking about my availability for virtual participation. We set up our first session for the second week of December, video call at 6 p.m. Pacific time so I could join after work. And when the day came, I logged in from my apartment with my stomach in knots and found my parents sitting together on their couch, looking nervous and uncomfortable. Dr. Chen was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a directness that I appreciated immediately. And she started by establishing ground rules about respect and honesty, and the commitment to show up even when it was difficult. And then she asked each of us to describe why we were there. My father spoke first about the financial crisis and wanting to repair the relationship with me. And my mother talked about realizing they'd hurt me and wanting to understand how, and when it was my turn, I said, I'm here because I spent my entire life being invisible in this family, and I'm not willing to accept that anymore. And if we're going to have any relationship going forward, it needs to be one where I'm actually seen and valued, not just when you need something from me. That first session was awkward and surface level, everyone too careful with their words. But Dr. Chen identified the core pattern within 30 minutes, she said. What I'm hearing is that Maya's competence became a reason to neglect her emotional needs, and that her parents interpreted self-sufficiency as not wanting connection, when in reality, she learned self-sufficiency as a survival mechanism because connection wasn't reliably available. And my mother looked startled like she'd never thought of it that way, and my father sat back heavily in his chair. Sienna didn't join that first session or the second one. My parents said she wasn't ready, which I knew meant she was still angry about the loan and the therapy requirement and the fact that I'd set boundaries she couldn't bulldoze through. Work became my refuge in a different way than before, not as an escape from pain, but as a place where my worth was obvious and quantifiable and celebrated. And 3 weeks before Christmas, I got called into a meeting with Sarah and the VP of Engineering, and they told me I was being promoted to lead engineer for our division, a role that came with a salary increase to $240,000, plus expanded stock options and leadership responsibilities for a team of 12 people. I accepted on the spot and called Ryan afterward, and he took me to dinner at this Italian place in North Beach, where we'd had our first date 6 months earlier. And over wine and pasta, he told me he was proud of me, and he'd never met anyone as strong as I was. And I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled my entire life. This sense that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, with someone who saw me clearly. On December 15th, my bank account showed the first loan payment from my parents. $1,933.33, the exact amount specified in the contract, arriving on the first of the month as agreed. 2 days later, my mother sent me a text that said, "Your father and I talked about what Dr. Chen said in our last session about how we made you feel like your accomplishments didn't matter, And I want you to know I've been thinking about your MIT graduation a lot, about how we should have been there. And I'm sorry, Maya. I'm really, truly sorry. And I read it 3 times looking for the usual qualifiers or pivots to Sienna's problems, but they weren't there. It was just an apology, simple and direct. And I wrote back, "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot that you're working on this." And I meant it. 6 months after that first therapy session, in late June, Sarah called me into her office on a Wednesday afternoon and told me the executive team had been watching my leadership on the infrastructure redesign project, and they wanted to promote me to lead engineer for our entire division, which meant I'd be overseeing a team of 12 engineers and architects with a salary of $240,000 plus a significant stock option grant that vested over 4 years. And when I checked my existing equity that evening, I realized my shares were now worth approximately $180,000 because the company's valuation had increased after our Series C funding round. The promotion felt surreal in the best way. This tangible proof that my work mattered and my skills were valued. And when I told Ryan over dinner that night, he raised his glass and said, "To the woman who never stopped believing in herself even when her family couldn't see what was right in front of them." And I felt tears prick my eyes because he was right. I had believed in myself, or at least I'd kept moving forward, even when belief faltered. My parents had been attending therapy consistently. We'd had 8 sessions total by that point, and the conversations had shifted from surface-level acknowledgments to deeper excavations of pattern and pain, and Dr. Chen had started asking them to do homework between sessions, like writing down specific memories of my childhood achievements and their responses to them, which forced them to confront how systematically they'd minimized my accomplishments. On July 2nd, 3 days after my promotion became official, I got an email from my father with the subject line, "Things I Should Have Said." And when I opened it, my breath caught because it was a 2-page letter that began, "Dear Maya, I've been working with Dr. Chen on understanding how I failed you as a father. And I'm writing this because I need you to know that I see it now. I see all of it, and I'm ashamed of the parent I was to you." He detailed specific moments, my 8th grade science fair, where I won first place, and he'd left early to pick Sienna up from a friend's house. My high school graduation, where he'd spent the whole dinner talking about Sienna's gap year plans, my acceptance to MIT, which he'd congratulated me on for 30 seconds, before asking if I'd talk to Sienna because she was having a hard day. He wrote, "You were extraordinary, and I treated you like you were ordinary, like your success was inevitable and didn't require support or celebration. And the truth is, I was intimidated by how capable you were because I didn't know how to help you the way I knew how to help your sister. And instead of learning, I just focused on where I felt needed, and that was inexcusable, and it cost you a father who showed up for you." The letter continued for another page, detailing his pride in specific accomplishments, my MIT degree, my career, the way I'd handled the loan situation with integrity and clear boundaries. And he ended with, "I know I can't get back the years when I should have been your biggest champion, but I'm asking for the chance to be that person now, if you'll let me." I read the letter 4 times sitting at my desk at work with tears running down my face, and then I wrote back, "Dad, thank you for writing this. It means more than you know. I'm willing to keep working on this together." And I meant it, even though the hurt was still there, because hurt and hope can exist simultaneously. 2 weeks later, my mother called and asked if she could visit San Francisco in August, just her, for a weekend. And she said, "I want to see your life, where you work, where you live. I want to meet Ryan properly. And I don't want anything from you. I just want to be part of your world for a couple days, if that's okay." And I said yes because her voice sounded different, humble and hopeful instead of entitled or distracted. The loan payments had arrived on time every single month, $1,933.33 on the first of each month without fail, and each payment felt like more than money. It felt like accountability made tangible. In early August, I got a text from Sienna, the first direct communication we'd had since Thanksgiving, and it said, I got a job teaching at Inner Light Studio, 6 classes a week. It's not my own place, but it's stable and I'm good at it. And I'm sorry for how I acted at Thanksgiving. I was drowning and I tried to pull you under with me and that wasn't fair. And I stared at that message for a long time before responding. I'm glad you found something stable. And I accept your apology. Maybe we can talk sometime when you're ready. And she wrote back, I'd like that. My mother arrived in San Francisco on the second Friday in August, flying in alone with a small suitcase and nervous energy that I could feel through the phone when she called from the airport, and I picked her up in my car and drove her to my condo in Soma, the 2-bedroom place I'd bought 6 months earlier with its floor-to-ceiling windows and view of the bay. And I watched her take it in with something like wonder in her eyes as she said, Maya, this is beautiful. You did this all yourself. And I said, yes, I did. We spent that weekend in a way we'd never spent time before. Just the two of us without my father's presence or Sienna's crises mediating every interaction, and I took her to my office on Saturday morning because the engineering team was doing a hackathon, and I wanted to show her the space where I'd built my career. And she met Sarah and Lucas and 3 of the engineers on my team, and I watched her face as Sarah told her, your daughter is the best lead engineer I've ever worked with. She's probably going to be running this entire division in 2 years. And my mother's eyes filled with tears that she tried to hide. That evening, Ryan came over for dinner, and I'd been nervous about them meeting properly, but he was warm and genuine, and he told my mother a story about the first time I'd explained distributed systems architecture to him and how he'd been completely lost, but absolutely certain he was listening to someone extraordinary. And my mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said, I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. How extraordinary you've always been. And I said, I know, Mom, I know you are. On Sunday morning, we walked through the Ferry Building Farmers Market and got coffee and sat by the water, and she told me that therapy had been harder than she'd expected because Dr. Chen kept pushing her to examine why she'd been so focused on Sienna, and she'd realized it was because Sienna's need had been loud and constant and my competence had been quiet. And it was easier to respond to noise than to look for what was hidden in silence. And she said, that's not an excuse. It's just what I'm learning about myself, that I failed you, not because you didn't matter, but because I didn't know how to see past the crisis of the moment to the child who was suffering in a different way. I told her I appreciated her honesty and that I was proud of the work she and Dad were doing, and I meant it, even though the hurt wasn't gone. Even though there were still moments when I remembered sitting at my MIT graduation, watching the empty seats where they should have been, and feeling so profoundly alone. She flew home Sunday evening and texted me when she landed saying, thank you for letting me into your life. I love you and I'm proud of you. And I wrote back, I love you too. And I realized I meant it without reservation for the first time in years. September came, and with it the recognition that I'd been at the company for 15 months and my life looked nothing like I'd imagined it would when I'd accepted that first offer letter. It looked better, more solid, built on foundations I'd poured myself without anyone's help or approval. The loan payments kept arriving like clockwork. And in mid-October, my father called to tell me they'd paid off the remortgage on the house, using money from selling my mother's parents' vacation cabin that had been sitting unused, and their financial situation was stabilizing. And he said, I know we still owe you $68,000, and we're going to pay every cent. But I wanted you to know we're going to be okay. You saved us, Maya, and more than that, you forced us to look at ourselves, and I'll never stop being grateful for that, even though I know it cost you.